Hello, it's Paul Driscoll here, aka the Drisk from the RGDS podcast. And this is me continuing my series of the best game of a letter arcade edition. And this is for the letter V. Now this is a series where I imagine a letter on a system. If I could only choose 5 games of that letter for the arcade, what would they be? So I'm not coming at it from the most historically important or most beloved, but for me, what 5 games would I choose today if all others had disappeared? Then of course I'll give loads of honourable mentions of games in this letter worthy of your time. So it's a great encapsulation of some of the great games and hidden gems to play in the letter V for the arcade. Anyway, as mentioned, this is really just a bit of fun and just an excuse to highlight some awesome games to you. So the next time that you're looking blindsided by a fully loaded emulator device, maybe some of these games will jump out at you and you'll give them a go. Perhaps there'll be some forgotten games that I mention, or it encourages you to play through some hidden gems that are totally new to you, and that's what it's all about really. Now this, as I mentioned, is for the letter V, and it has some amazing games for what is really such a small letter, but I think you're going to love the choices here. So sit back and let me take you through my personal top 5 choices for the letter V. Okay, so we're on my 5th choice, and I've decided for the wonderful game Viewpoint. This was released in 1992 by Sammy, and it appeared on the Neo Geo Multi-Video System MVS arcade, or the Advanced Entertainment System or AES on the Neo Geo home console. Sporting some absolutely awesome funky music, this isometric shooter was rock hard, but it was so addictive. I remember seeing this game in one of the first issues of Edge magazine and salivating and dreaming about playing this game based on those screenshots. Later I did try some of the various home ports and was a little disappointed because they're a shadow of the original former self. So it wasn't until emulation allowed me to play the game as it was meant to be played that I really, truly fell in love with this game. I think it's the cool visuals, the tight shooting gameplay, and quite tactical with some of the level designs. And of course that amazing music, 1, 2, 3, 4, hit it! Which immediately sends me into adoring this game. Of course, that initial soundbite is from Curtis Blow's song AJ Scratch. But you know, as soon as I heard that music, I knew this game was for me. As I mentioned, the game is tough, but you can get better as you progress each of the 6 levels and the 2 bosses, and it does draw you on. It is fair despite its difficulty. Now, outside of the Neo Geo original game, the title was ported to the FM Towns and X68000 machines, and they did incredibly good jobs of it, with only the sound side of things letting it down. The same you could say with the Mega Drive as well, which didn't run as fast or anything, and the sound let it down. But for me, the real disappointment though was when the PlayStation finally got its port. You see, I was so excited because of course the PlayStation should be able to run a Neo Geo game absolutely perfectly, but for some reason they really messed around with the game's interior. It has different music and they've made gameplay changes, and it all just makes it a mess of a game. I don't like it. I much prefer the Neo Geo original. Now sadly, Viewpoint, probably because of the music, never ever seems to make it to any of the Neo Geo retro bundles, so unfortunately you're going to have to use something like MAME to emulate this game and enjoy. But please do, it's well worth your time. Okay, now on to my 4th choice, and I decided on Virtua Racing, released by Sega in 1992. Now, on its release, this was a total revelation, bringing fast, fluid racing in true, fully rendered 3D for the first time. Now, I know what you're going to say. Sure, 3D games came out before, of course they did, but they all use little tricks to not all be 3D or running very, very slow. Games like Hard Driving or the fantastic, and I do love it, Stun Runner. But this was the first true 3D game that was in the arcades, and the speed that it had as well just made it such a winner for me. You know, I think what was amazing with virtual racing, there'd never been such variety and true racing experience in 3D at that time, and Sega, you know, and AM2 really knew what they were doing in making it a great racer, and it shows here with every polygon and fast, smooth, fluid action. Now, originally, this arcade machine cost a whopping £20,000 for arcade owners back in the day to pick it up. Not surprising, only your big vendors and arcade machine outlets had this game. It was a big outlay in a tough arcade world, meaning that only the few need apply really, and that's why I think a lot of people didn't see this. I personally remember seeing this game, and the excitement of first seeing the arcade was on the TV show Bad Influence. Now here it was weirdly introduced by Take That, you know, the band, Robbie Williams, etc. And, you know, I thought, this is amazing, this is the future. I was so excited based on that segment. Now later I did see it in the arcades finally, and it was obvious to me in seeing it that it was the future of gaming. You know, and AM2 were again leading the way, just as they had done before with Yu Suzuki as director, you know, doing outrun and sprite scaling techniques. Now, although they led the world with this 3D arcade games, it really was amazing how quickly things started to jump in leaps and bounds with, you know, only a year later, games like Ridge Racer and Daytona coming along. Giving texture map 3D racing, and in many ways making it rather obsolete, the Virtua racing game. But back to the game itself, I mean, it had 3 tracks and 16 racers on the track, and it had different views. You could select the actions, vibrant, bold colours, and iconic track locations from basically the Golden Gate Bridge to giant Ferris wheels and fun fairs that made the game so iconic in many people's eyes, myself included. And even today, the speed of this game is truly breathtaking, with its simplistic art style, by necessity of course, but giving it its own unique look and feel that still looks fantastic today. Now, to make this 3D leap in gaming, and of course Sega used it again and again in all of their Virtua series, Sega engaged the help of General Electric Aerospace, or GEA, and this was the company that had made the first 3D simulators for NASA way back in the 60s, and it was still at the forefront of simulation for the serious side. So in 1991 and 1992, their assistants ended up developing the CG platform architecture for their new experimental 3D for Sega, you know, working with them. And of course that became known as the Sega Model 1 hardware, which is what all of this ran on. And it's at this point when Sega truly started to take the gaming world by 3D wonder, obviously bringing things like Virtua Fighter and Virtua Striker and Virtua Cop and, of course, Virtua Racing as we have here. Now, consequently, given how quickly technology improved in the arcade for 3D racing, the arcade machines didn't really have very long gameplay legs, but in the home it had a longer life, and that's probably where most people enjoyed the game, if I'm honest. The Mega Drive had a technically impressive home port where they put extra chips on the cart to recreate the action. Even better, the 32X improved on the faithfulness of that arcade original even more. But back in the day, for me, it was the Sega Saturn port and the Virtua Racing Deluxe Edition, as it was known, that I was enamoured with. It effortlessly recreated the experience, adding more tracks and a Grand Prix mode to let you work your way through the ranks from kart racing up to Formula 1. This made it for me the ultimate way, and still the ultimate way, to play this game, even though I've heard a lot of people criticise the actual port, which I think is unjust. Now in Japan, Virtua Racing did find its way onto a remaster on the PS2, and in the West we saw that as the Sega Classic Collection. It was the a single collection of these remasters that Sega had done, Sega Ages. And yeah, it's fine, but nothing on the original really. Now these days, to enjoy the game in the home, the best way is to pick it up on the Nintendo Switch, the Sega Ages digital game that they have for Virtua Racing. This brings it up to a solid 60 frames per second, and it's a beautiful port. Of course, missing all the extras of the Sega Saturn version, but what you do have is a solid and wonderful recreation of the Virtua Racing in the arcade, and so for that it's really the only way to play. Of course, you know, you can play this on the Sega Model 2 or M2 emulator. That does a great job of recreating the arcade game as it was meant to be back in the day, but of course it won't be a solid 60 frames per second on that one. Okay, so let's go on to my third choice, and I've gone for yet another Virtua series game. Yeah, spoiler alert, there's going to be a lot of these in the letter V in my choices. And for number 3, the choice was Virtua Fighter 2. Again, of course, by Sega, and released in 1994, and only a year on from the first game in the series. Now, the reason I've chosen the sequel is it honed all that was great about the original 3D fighter, but hones it to perfection. And for me at least, the series hasn't been bettered, despite the continual expansions to both the player roster and graphics. I just think it hasn't been bettered from the second iteration. Now I remember seeing this in the arcades as well, and wowing and drooling at the game in action with its buttery smooth fluid animations and the fights looking so cool and badass, both to watch and control. Now it was no wonder that this was so impressive, as this was on the new Sega Model 2A board, and it really was an upgrade from the Model 1. I mean, this time you had 300,000 polygons a second moving around. I mean, that's double what the original arcade game could muster in Virtua Fighter 1. And this meant, you know, the game's vastly more beautiful as a game. It's got unprecedented levels of background detail and character detail, which really helps bring the characters and players to life. It was so impressive for the time, and even today there's a certain beauty to that filtered, texture shaded polygon design of the Virtua Fighter 2 game. Now, like the Virtua Racing, it's another game directed by Yu Suzuki, and you know, he'd increased the original 9 characters to a roster of 11, bringing back such favourites as Akira Yuki, Pai-chan and Lao-chan, and of course Wolf and Hawkfield, Jackie Bryant and Sarah Bryant and Doral, but additionally adding in the player that I love, Sundin. Now he was a cool old guy with a white beard, and you know, he was a great fun. And of course the other added character was Lion Raphael, which was for me less loved. Now they did do a 2.1 version of the game, fixing odd bug fixes and gameplay enhancements to the game, and this is the one in the arcades you most will have played. But if honest, despite my love for the game, it was so expensive to play in the arcades, costing £1 a go, meaning that if it was set on high difficulty, once it usually was in the arcades, I didn't listen, because as I am today, pretty useless at games. So I was really excited when it came to the home ports and the Sega Saturn and PC versions started to arrive. The Sega Saturn was just, for me at the time, the pinnacle. I mean, it was such a great version. It sort of sidestepped all the hardware limitations and using sort of like basically sprites for some of the backgrounds and things, but you wouldn't know it was a very intelligent way of getting the game across. I mean, even the humble Mega Drive came out with a version of the game, and despite it doing its best, I mean, of course it was a pale shadow to the arcade original. Now, it wouldn't be until a full decade on, in 2004, when we saw finally a faithful home port on the PS2 on the Sega Ages Volume 16 in Japan. In the West, we only saw faithful ports in 2012 on the Xbox 360 and PS3 digital shops. Now nowadays you can still buy the game Virtua Fighter in these digital shops, thankfully. The Xbox console, for example, has it for only £3.39, I mean a real steal. Alternatively, of course, you can play it on emulation in MAME, or even better, the Sega Model Emulator, as you see here. Okay, let's go and move on to my second choice. And I've chosen, yes, another Virtua Series game, and yes, another Yu Suzuki directed game, with Virtua Cop 2, released in 1995, and only a year after the original game had been released on Virtua Cop. Now, like that first game, it was an on-rails light gun shooter where cops must take out the EVIL syndicate, who's still at large despite your takedown of them in the first game. Now, the reason I chose the second game is because the sequel has all the cool elements of the original, such as the justice points where you don't kill the enemy, just disarm them. But what the sequel does, it adds the variety and fun to the locations. You know, I mean, one minute you're doing a jewellery heist of trying to, you know, stop a jewellery heist, and then the next you're in a daring car chase, careening around corners and blasting out the criminals. The action just never relents right up to the final end boss. Now, the game had a really solid Sega Saturn port that even had the Virtua Cop Sega guns included. In 1996, on its release, it was the only way to play it, and boy did I play the heck out of it in the home. I mean, it was such a wonderful, faithful adaptation, and it's a great way to experience the game, as long as you have a CRT and the light guns, of course. Now, the PC had a nice version as well in 1997. And even better, in 2000, the Dreamcast Sega Smash Pack Volume 1 had Virtua Cop 2 on it as well, offering for the first time arcade perfect port in the home. And of course, the Dreamcast had light guns as well, it was compatible with. But still, really, the only best way to play it was 2002 PS2 port. In the West, it's called the Virtua Cop Elite Edition, or Rebirth Edition in Japan, and it gives you upscaled versions of Virtua Cop and Virtua Cop 2 games in one package. So it's enhancing it graphically over the original, and even better, it's compatible with the fantastic Namco G-Con 2 light guns. So if you've got a CRT and the guns, this is a no-brainer. This is the best way to enjoy Virtua Cop today. And to be honest, even if you don't have a CRT and the light guns, it actually plays really well on controller. They do a lot of tweaks to the controls to make it quite enjoyable. So this works great under PS2 emulation as well, and of course on PC. Now, alternatively, the Sega Model Emulator that also does a fantastic job of emulating these games perfectly as well. And of course that lets you use a mouse, which is a nice way to play it. Okay, we're on to my number one choice for my favourite arcade game beginning with the letter V. And of course it's another Virtua game. And it is the fantastic Virtua Tennis 2 Sega Professional Tennis, or Virtua Tennis 2 as it's known to its mates. It was released by Sega in 2001 and was a few years after the 1999 original. Now, in Japan it's known as Power Smash 2 Sega Professional Tennis, so you might see it as that name. The game took all that was great about the first, with gameplay mechanics buttery smooth, and it still makes it the best tennis game ever. But this time in the sequel they've doubled the roster, not only including men but women players. It also includes 2 hidden secret characters you might not know about, where you eventually, if you get through the whole tournament, you get to play either the king or queen, and they'll challenge you to beat you in tournament mode. I mean, even better on the home ports, incidentally, the PS2 and PSP versions, you can even unlock the king and queen as playable characters, which is awesome. I just love this game. Nothing beats those fantastic volleys and the feeling of being truly in control and tactically deciding and directing the shot to win that point of the game. It's such a great 2-player or 4-player game, because of course you can play doubles. Now I remember seeing this in the arcades, but if honest, it was the fantastic Sega Dreamcast port that made me fall in love with the game and the original. Now on the sequel I had got bizarrely the US version, which had named it Sega Sports Tennis 2K2, so it would be in keeping with their Sega 2K2 branding. Very bizarre choice, and thankfully in Europe, which I also eventually bought it on, it was just called Virtual Tennis 2, much more sensible. But I adored this version. It was one of the few on the Dreamcast that made use of the 4-player ports, so you could play like doubles with no adapters, and yeah, it's just fantastic. And as I mentioned, in 2002, PlayStation 2 and also the PSP in 2005 saw solid ports of this game as well. Now today, playing the Sony PS2 or Dreamcast is still, in my mind, the best way to enjoy this game, outside of the Redream or PS2 emulators, of course, where it upscales everything and you can play the arcade original. But there you go, that was my top 5 for the letter V and the arcade games, and I would love to hear the comments and ones that you would choose for the letter V. What would you have chosen? And also please consider clicking the like button, as it really helps getting these videos to more people, and that's what it's all about really. I just do it for fun, but it's nice when more people see it and comment and things. It shows people are at least enjoying, or hopefully enjoying, your work, so please consider doing that. But anyway, let's go through some honourable mentions of ones that I think are worthy of a shout out as well. So let's start with the shooter genre. My word, we've got some amazing shooters for the letter V, and actually quite a lot of shooters. And on a different day, many of these probably would have made my top 5. Now first we have the 1981 game Vanguard. This is a brilliant SNK full colour shooter that first put SNK on the map for the West, with its being their first big hit. And it's easy to see why as well. I mean, a great for the time scrolling shooter that was very reminiscent of Scramble but running with it. It also had cool music. They'd inserted the Star Trek motion picture theme tune, or better known as the Star Trek The Next Generation theme tune by most people. But also, even when you picked up a power-up, you get the Flash Gordon film, the Vultans theme, with all the flying hawks. So, it's great. I just loved the time when video games, particularly in Japan, didn't seem to care about copyright, because I bet they didn't license those music. Now, the game's enjoyable, and it's undeniably groundbreaking in the history of horizontal shooters, or shooters in general. Genuinely took the game Scramble and ran with it. But ultimately, this game personally isn't my favourite. I'm not even that much of a fan of Scramble, if I'm honest. But I do understand the love for it, and that's why it deserves an honourable mention here. Now, its 1984 sequel is quite a departure, with Vanguard 2 being a complete different affair, this time being an overhead game. And here you must destroy the power pods to enter the core finally. It feels a lot like Time Pilot 84 in both look and feel. And it's an okay fun diversion. I quite like this actually. I actually prefer, gameplay wise, this is more in keeping with things I enjoy over the difficult original game. Right, let's look at the 1988 game Vulcan Venture by Konami, which of course is the Western release name for Gradius 2. It's really complex, the naming of the Gradius series, and it all stems because the original was called Nemesis in Europe, and so Gradius 2 would be confusing, so they gave it another name of Vulcan Venture. But technically even more confusing, this is the third in the series if you include the spin-off Salamander. Anyway, on to the game itself. This game is more of the same. You're piloting the Vic Viper once more, taking out the enemies. It follows pretty much the same weapon upgrade bar of the original, but this time it has more upgrade paths. It's a nice sequel if you like the original. I mean, I personally find the arcade games are far too tough for my crap skills, so I guess I get frustrated with it. But I do appreciate why people love this. Much better for me though is the brilliant Toplin 1993 shooter V5, which is the Japanese release name of Blind Stormer. So I think mentioned it in the letter G as well. This was the first arcade game of Kenichi Takano. Now, he would go on to be the co-founder and later CEO of Cave, and so he was director of most Cave games. I adore this vertical blaster, and for the longest time it had my number 5 slot, and probably on a different day I probably would choose it again. I mean, I also adore the Mega Drive port of this. It's really solid as well. I mean, overall, I adore this game. I think it's just my memories of Viewpoint just pipped it at the post. Now, another great shooter, often overlooked, is Viper Phase 1, released in 1995 by Seibu Kahatsu Incorporated. Now, this is actually a spin-off from the Raiden series, but set in space, and it's a worthy shooter in the Raiden canon that everyone unfairly forgets about. So, try this Gem Blaster today. And talking about forgotten shooters, then there's the wonderful Varth, Operation Thunderstorm by Capcom, and released in 1992. This is a solid, if by the numbers, blaster. I mean, it's well worthy of your time, and a lot of people don't know about it because it never originally saw a home court back in the day. I mean, thankfully it did appear on the Capcom Collection Volume 1 on the Xbox, PS2 and GameCube era, and again more recently on the Capcom Arcade Stadium collection, so there are thankfully legitimate ways of playing it today outside of MAME. Likewise, talking of Capcom shooters, Vulgus is another that has the honour not only being a good shooter, but actually being Capcom's first ever game they released way back in 1984. It's a simple vertical shooter, but it has lots of charm and it's well worthy of your time. It's made by Takuro Fujiwara, another of Konami's luminaries brought across. Now, he would go on to direct Ghosts and Goblins Commando and was a planner on the game Strider, to name but a few. It's a great introduction and shows his skill and instinctive knowledge of good gameplay. Now, today you can pick this up on the Capcom Classic Collection on the Xbox and PS3, but even better, the Capcom Arcade Stadium on the recent consoles also has this game as well. And of course, as you're seeing here, it runs perfectly on MAME as well. Now, as you can see, the letter V is well served for vertical shooters, and the games keep on coming with Vasara, released in 2000 by Visco Corporation. Now, this is a bizarre mix with it being set in the 17th century, but it's Japan, but being a steampunk Japan, which is a nice idea. It's a cool vertical shooter that, whilst it's not going to set the world on fire, it's a fun little blaster. Now, it would follow with Vasara 2, released by Visco again in 2001. This is more of the same, and that's not a bad thing. Thankfully, to play both of these, you can get them in a bundle on modern consoles. It's known as a Vasara collection, and they're often on sale, so it's a great way to pick these up. Of course, as you can see here, MAME runs them perfectly as well. Now, one thing rare to see by Toplin is a shooter that isn't that good or a flop, but Vimana is one of those games. Released in 1991, it's just sadly just that. It's a game that is not exactly terrible, but just devoid of ideas and just really generic. And so consequently, it's a rare misstep for the Toplin company, for shooters at least. Still, if you love your Toplin games and you want to see the complete library, this is well worth a quick go on MAME at least. Unfortunately, you never ever see it as legitimate released, probably because Toplin are quite ashamed of it. Now, another interesting arcade tank shooter is Atari's 1988 game Vindicators. Now, it's made by a trio of veteran Atari game designers such as Kelly Turner, who had done Super Sprint, Championship Sprint, Badlands and Atari Tetris. There's Norm Vella, now he did Star Wars and Badlands, and Russell Dorr, who did Tubin and Rampart. So you got some real talent working on this game, and it's a really good twin stick tank shooter that's a lot of fun to play. I had a lot of good time with this. I mean, I would love to see this in Arcade Club. I mean, they do have Assault which is a very similar game, but I think this is the more polished of the two. It also has a gorgeous cabinet design of kind of looking like a tank, which I think is wonderful. Now, the game did see a variety of home ports, although it really wasn't until the release of the Midway Arcade compilation on the Xbox, PS2 and GameCube that we saw an arcade perfect conversion of it in the home. These days, really the best way to play it is on MAME though, sadly. Even better though, in my opinion, is Vindicators Part 2, which came out in the following year in 1989, and it was only as a Gauntlet conversion kit. Now, it's essentially the same game, but there's a lot of gameplay tweaks, and I found it a lot more enjoyable and fun over the original game, so that would be the one that I personally would recommend. Now, finally, in the shooter genre, we have a really interesting 1981 XD arcade game called Venture. Now, this is an overhead run-and-gun game like Berserk, although it's set in a fantasy dungeon this time rather than robots. What I love about it has the added complexity of zooming in on the action when you enter a room, thus making the areas a lot more involved. Now, it's made by Howell Ivey of Chiller, Crossbow, Barricade and Circus fame, and I think this is an early fun romp and a great fun, for early arcade games. It's one I definitely will be going back to. Okay, so that was all the shooters. My word, there was quite a lot there, but let's go on to the light gun shooters, as we do have a few to mention here. Of course, there's the other games in the Virtua Cop series, with the first being released in 1994, and it's still a fantastic game, just not as exciting locations as the original game, but I adore it almost as much as the sequel. Likewise, there is the third game in the series, which is okay, but it just feels missing some of the charm of the original for some reason. Now, another often forgotten about light gun blaster is Vampire Knight by Namco and released in 2001. Now, this was their answer to House of the Dead, but with vampires. This has a great PS2 home port, and it's probably the best way to play it if you've got a CRT, but even if you haven't, it works quite well with the controller. Now, finally, for light gun shooters, there's the iconic Versus Duck Hunt game. Now, to be fair, for the most part, I've decided not to include most of the Versus series. I mean, they were essentially, in all cases, just the Famicom game brought across. But there are some exceptions where additional elements have been added to the game, and they're mild, I guess, but Versus Duck Hunt actually has more frames of animation on the dog, and even better, it has the ability you can shoot that blimmin' chortling mutt of a dog on the bonus round, which is hilarious because he's there all injured with his foot in a cast. I think it's worth it for that alone, to play the arcade game. Always great, still wonderful to play today. Now, the other Versus game in the Nintendo arcade series worth mentioning is Versus Super Mario Bros., released in 1986. Now, this took the Famicom original game, but put tweaks where they made it a considerably tougher challenge. In fact, some of the levels were the ones used on the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2. Now, you can actually play this specific version legitimately, thankfully, on the Switch on Arcade Archives collection, and of course it is on MAME as well. Right, now we go on to racing, and this was a really pleasant surprise for me with Atari's 1998 futuristic racer Vapor TRX. It's designed by Dave Ralston of Paperboy, 720 Degrees, Rampart, and home games such as The Haunting by Poltergeist and Skitchin, to name but a few of his fun, weird games. And this is surprising. It's a really fun, futuristic, fast racer. I had a lot of fun with this, and it's one that I'm definitely going back to because it was new to me, if I'm honest. I had not tried this game before. Now we come though to fighting games, and of course you've got to mention the others in the Virtua Fighter series, because of course I chose Virtua Fighter 2, but we should mention there was Virtua Fighter 1 that came out in 1993, and that was the game that revolutionised 3D fighting game, and they did lots of spin-offs, such as 1995's Virtua Fighter Remix. Now this improved the resolution of the game characters in the arcade, but it was the Sega Saturn port where they decided to add in a lot more to the game that I truly love. I mean, on the Sega Saturn port you had Kunio-kun style versions of all the fighters, not all of them, just a handful, and you also had bizarre additional characters taken from Fighting Vipers, but even more amazing things like slabs of meat and the AM2 palm tree logo you could fight with, or even the Daytona Hornet car. I mean, there was so much imagination and fun in the Sega Saturn port, well worthy of your time. Now in 1996 they also did the Virtua Kids in the arcade because it had been so popular on the Sega Saturn with the remix. So this was all the fighters this time, rather than just a handful of the Kunio-kun style done as kids, and it just adds cuteness to already fun game. It's a nice variation. Also in 1996 was Virtua Fighter 3. This used the Sega Model 3 hardware, which meant it ran faster, it looked prettier, but more importantly they added in a dodge button. This made the game a lot more tactical with how you fought, and it's very difficult to go back to it once you get used to that dodge button to go back to earlier iterations. Now talking of iterations, it did slightly involve number 3 with a team battle variant, TB as it was shortened to, which of course was the one that you got on the Dreamcast that was such a solid port that had net play as well, which in the arcades that was a big deal. I mean, in 2001 you finally got Virtua Fighter 4, and that was the next big leap in the arcades, at least, that you could suddenly do online play for a fighting game. That was quite revolutionary. Now further iterations of Virtua Fighter 4 would be made, Evolution in 2002 and Final Tuned in 2004. But it was Virtua Fighter 5 in 2006 that was the next true big leap, with much prettier graphics and much more nuanced gameplay to some of the earlier iterations. Now likewise, I went through many revisions when going through this, but Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown in 2010 was the one that you got on the Xbox 360 and PS3, and is a really solid enhanced version of the game. And the PS4 actually saw an enhanced version of that game, making it the most beautiful Virtua Fighter games to play. So a great series. But other fighters that people might not be aware of for the letter V is the Capcom's Vampire Hunter Darkstalker series. These are great. I mean, first of all, you had Vampire the Night Warriors, which is the Darkstalkers as it's also known. That came out in 1994. Awesome game. Great sort of playing against the monsters. There was also, though, the sequel Vampire Hunter Darkstalker's Revenge, which came out in 1995. This tweaks with the roster added a few more characters and things. It's a great update. Likewise, the Vampire Savior, which is hyphenated as the Lord of Vampire, came out in 1997 and is another solid update. And Vampire Saver 2, the Lord of Vampire, also appeared that same year as well. And finally there's Vampire Hunter 2 Darkstalker's Revenge, which came out in 1997, all being further iterations on the last. Now, I really enjoy the series. It's a great 2D beat 'em up, full of monstrous characters to fight against. I mean, what's not to like? But finally, for fighters, one must mention the Virtuon series. These twin mech warrior fighter games, sort of arena shooting games, is a lot of fun. Starting with Virtua on Cyber Troopers in 1985. This is great fun, and it was a really wonderful, solid Saturn port, which, particularly if you had the controls, was a great way to play it in the home. I mean, this was followed up by Cyber Troopers Virtua on Oratorio Tangram, which came out in 1998. It improved the graphics, the player roster, the player locations, and this one had a great version with the Dreamcast port and also the official home port controller that you could use for Virtua On. Finally, in 2001 in the arcades, there was Cyber Troopers Virtua On 4 Force. Now all of these in the series are great fun, enjoyable to play, and just a real laugh. I do enjoy playing these games. Okay, let's move on to the beat-em-up genre for the letter V, and we've got a trio of classics to share. Now first we have the 1988 IREM classic, or IREM as I like to call them incorrectly, which is Vigilante. Now what a lot of people don't know, actually this is the sequel to Kung Fu Master, and it has our hero rescue his kidnapped girlfriend Madonna, so he takes to the streets to wreak and seek revenge on all those nasty thugs. Now another great game beat 'em up is Vendetta. I adore this game, and for the longest time it was my number 5 slot as well. It's made by Konami this time, and it came out in 1991. Now it is known in Japan as Crime Fighters 2, as the first one was Crime Fighters, and it did have some of the Konami greats who worked on this game. You know, people behind games like Contra and Aliens working on it. So this is a classic beat 'em up of every stripe, and one of my favourites. One of the things that's great, it has very recognisable real world player characters. You know, there's Hawk, who, yeah, let's be honest, he looks just like Hulk Hogan. Sledge, who, you know, you may, as Mr. T might say, pity the fool for looking just like Mr. T. Then there was Jean-Claude Van Damme, Boomer. And finally you get Blood, a boxer who may or may not be Mike Tyson. I mean, I just love, you know, the lack of concern of copyright license. Now the game has a lot of neat touches, such as smashing the enemies into the background with planks of wood. And as a beat 'em up, I was thrilled to see this 3-player beat 'em up in the arcade club in Bury. I mean, it's one of the few games on the list that's here for the letter V, so great to see and great to play. But what many people might not know is there's actually a sequel to Vendetta called Violent Storm. It was made by Konami in 1993, and it's set in a post-apocalyptic world. It sports a really cool 80s rock music soundtrack, and it's got big, bright, bold and absolutely huge playable characters and things that you're up against. I find this fighter a lot of fun actually, and whilst it's not as good or nuanced as the Vendetta game, it's still worth tracking down. And so that brings us to the last of the genres, for the letter V at least, and the first game that we have is Virtua Striker by Sega. It came out in 1995, and it really did the smoothest 3D football game in the arcades or gaming in general, with great arcade footy action and really impressive details to the characters. I mean, only Gremlins Actua Soccer could really hold a candle to this game. In the arcades it was unrivaled really. Now Virtua Striker was just great. I mean, years later we did get digital home ports of the game on the Xbox 360 and PS3 in the digital shops, and of course Virtua Soccer did see sequels which did finally get home ports, thankfully, unlike the original. The Dreamcast got Virtua Striker 2 in 1999, and that was one that I personally have a lot of fond memories of. And Virtua Striker 2002 came out in the arcades, and also the GameCube. So that was another great version. Now another Virtua series that failed to take off was Virtua Athlete, which came out in 2000. It was Sega's answer to the popular track and field games. It was really enjoyable, playable and okay I guess, but I always felt it needed a lot more humour and less seriousness to make it a classic like track and field. It took itself too seriously, I felt. Now finally, there is of course the Virtua Tennis games that weren't Virtua Tennis 2. I mean, Virtua Tennis 1 came out in 1999, and yes, it only had the men players in the first iteration, but it had all the classic game controls and fun of the original. I mean, it just was an instant classic as far as I was concerned. You know, later the PSP And Sumo Digital did another great handheld version of the virtual tennis games. And you'd also see the GBA even seeing a port in 2006. But it was with Virtua Tennis 3 that we really came back to the arcades again and their big step up. And then finally there was Virtua Tennis 2009, which was on the 360 and PS3, but that had no arcade port. It was really an update to Virtua Tennis 3. But finally in 2011 you did get Virtua Tennis 4 on most of the home consoles. And in the arcades, it's a pinnacle of graphics. Technoparrot does run it perfectly, thankfully, as well. But sadly, that's when Sega would leave this wonderful series, leaving it totally stagnant. Outside of a few poor mobile games, including the notorious N-Gage, they've never really gone back to it. And I think it's such a shame. I mean, Sega, please pick up this game again. We don't even need licensed players if that's what the problem is. It's just all about the gameplay. So please release it. Anyway, there you go. That was my top 5 and my countless recommendations for the letter V. Let me know in the comments what you would have chosen. I would love to hear what you would have gone for, and perhaps even discovering things that I perhaps missed out on. So if you like this video, please don't forget in the vid notes to consider clicking like and subscribing as I go through the alphabet, and of course we get our podcast content as well. And of course in the show notes I've put the playlist which has the letter A through to currently the letter U and now V. So I'm slowly building my way through the alphabet here on this series. So plenty of content for you to enjoy and love. So please consider subscribing and liking the video. It's so hard starting a YouTube channel and get noticed in today's saturated world. So any subscribe, any watch, any like, any comment is so greatly appreciated, because not only is it wonderful to know that there's people enjoying the content, but it also helps that big YouTube algorithm in the sky to show these videos to more people and hopefully get more people into these video variants. Anyway, look out for future podcast episodes and next few videos, and of course for this I will be doing the letter W in the arcades. It's going to be another amazing letter to do. I can't wait. Got some real favourites in the letter W. So until next time, keep it retro.